literally every inhabited continent, every region, every people, every indigenous group of people have legends about wild men. And they're often described in the same way: taller than an average human being, covered in hair. The behavior is often the same: throwing stones and wood knocks in the forest and things like that. And I can't overemphasize this enough. I mean, in Australia, the indigenous Australians talked about the Yowie. In Russia, you have the Almasti. In China, you have the Yeren. Throughout Europe, there are medieval legends of wild men. Even in South Africa, indigenous South Africans have talked about the otang, which is this bipedal primate that runs around. And then in South America, you've got the Mapinguari, but just variants everywhere, right? And some of these are even hyper-local, hyper-regional.
Welcome back. I'm here with Joshua Cutchin. Josh, welcome, my friend.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're going to talk about something I've never talked about, at least focused a single episode on, and that's Sasquatch. So what's the deal with this thing? Is it real? Is it not? Like a Patterson-Gimlin film and even people can't even agree on that. That's like kind of the most compelling evidence out there. How did you get into this?
Oh my goodness. Well, I found out years after the fact, like well into my 20s, that my father was apparently subscribed to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization newsletter at some point. So I guess maybe it's genetic, but Sasquatch was something that was probably my first love in terms of these topics in general. And so I was checking out books and things like that. And if I bought any sort of paranormal or paranormal adjacent books, it would be books on Bigfoot. For the longest time, that was solely my thing. So it's just been a lifelong fascination. So there's this thing that I say sometimes, that all other domains of speculation have Bigfoot envy, because in terms of at least the publicly available evidence, right? Because we can talk about crash retrievals and metamaterials and whatnot. But in terms of the publicly available evidence, like the evidence for the existence of something strange in the woods is so profound and so strong. You know, you've got these casts that represent to me the gold standard of physical paranormal evidence in this case, because you have people who have degrees in anthropology and primatology and kinesiology, you know, the study of movement, who are examining and scrutinizing this evidence. And then you have, on top of that, samples of hair and of alleged flesh and even alleged droppings. And so there seems to be this just absolute abundance of physical evidence. And that to me was one of the most compelling things. And to this day, even though my own perspective on the Bigfoot question has changed to embrace a broader, stranger, less popular interpretation of the phenomenon, the first book that I will press into people's hands is Jeff Meldrum's Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, because it just does such a good job of outlining that physical evidence and how it is consistent with what you would expect from an undiscovered primate. So I think that was really one of the things that seized me early on, was the fact that there is such strong evidence for something strange in the uninhabited regions of North America.
And is that typically the range of Sasquatch? Like, what parts of North America does one find these creatures?
This is where it gets dicey real quick, right? Because if you just want to use the term Sasquatch or Bigfoot, it would be confined to North America. But if you broaden your scope, literally every inhabited continent, every region, every people, every indigenous group of people have legends about wild men. And they're often described in the same way: taller than an average human being, covered in hair. The behavior is often the same: throwing stones and wood knocks in the forest and things like that. And I can't overemphasize this enough. I mean, in Australia, the indigenous Australians talked about the Yowie. In Russia, you have the Almasti. In China, you have the Yeren. Throughout Europe, there are medieval legends of wild men. Even in South Africa, indigenous South Africans have talked about the otang, which is this bipedal primate that runs around. And then in South America, you've got the Mapinguari, but just variants everywhere, right? And some of these are even hyper-local, hyper-regional.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Bain Books at bain.com.
Within the United States, the commonly held assertion that you'll hear is that Bigfoot is seen in 49 states, restricted to the mainland United States and Canada, with the exception of Hawaii. Now, I've since found some stories that sound an awful lot like Bigfoot, tall giants, sometimes hairy, leaving behind giant footprints in Hawaii. So I kind of wonder if that's a misnomer at this point. But typically when we talk about Bigfoot and Sasquatch, using those terms interchangeably, we're talking about the United States and Canada. Less sightings in the American Southwest. Typically, sightings tend to congregate, obviously, in heavily wooded or uninhabited areas around sources of water. But having said that, there's an entire tradition in the area around Joshua Tree of this Bigfoot creature known as the Yucca Man that is named because he looks like a walking yucca tree. So you'll find stories of Bigfoot literally everywhere. And then once you start to embrace the possibility of Bigfoot not being a giant primate, you can start to find stories of urban Bigfoot. I've collected stories from parks in Chicago that are sometimes accompanied by footprints. And once you start going down that particular rabbit hole, the possibility that we're dealing with a flesh and blood creature that still, after all these decades, has remained undiscovered seems less and less tenable. And I'm very familiar with all the mainstream cryptozoological views that, we don't often run into bear and cougar carcasses, but people have at certain points in humankind's history. Like that's been a thing. So I would have thought by now that we would have some sort of specimen, live or dead, to show for our efforts. And so where my perspective has led me over the years is sympathizing and understanding a lot of these skeptical arguments, but at the same time having that clash with that gold standard of evidence that we see in the Bigfoot phenomenon and trying to reconcile those two. And for me, the path out of that has been entertaining the possibility that Bigfoot is stranger than a living specimen. But we can stay on the subject of Bigfoot as a living specimen for a while if you want to.
Yeah, let's go through some of the arguments and some of the evidence with that, and then we can work our way into the stranger aspects of Bigfoot sightings and potentially where it would help kind of explain why you don't find bodies and things like that.
Yeah, so certainly I think the bread and butter of cryptozoology in the pursuit of Bigfoot are these footprints, and not just solely relegated to footprints. We have what appear to be handprints, massive handprints, sometimes muddy, sometimes left on car windows and whatnot. And when they are scrutinized, they do yield an abundance of support for the idea that we're dealing with a flesh and blood primate. Chief among these, the most that you'll hear about, are these dermal ridges, which are basically the equivalent of a fingerprint, but on your toes. And close examination of the casts reveal that those are indeed present. There are certain amounts of slippage that occur in certain media that are completely consistent with the size and weight that witnesses report. There's also a function of primate foot anatomy known as the mid-tarsal break, which human beings do not have, which is sort of a pivot point, pivot joint in the foot. There is also some interesting circumstantial evidence in the form of some of these tracks. Sometimes they exhibit deformities or injuries that are consistent with the assessments of podiatrists. A podiatrist will look at a Bigfoot cast and say, oh, this is exactly what we would expect if someone had broken their third metatarsal or something like that. Mm-hmm. The most famous of those being the Bossburg, Oregon tracks, colloquially known as the Cripplefoot tracks, which went an extreme distance and presented one foot as having this sort of deformity, which again was consistent with what you would expect from a human wound. And the question, of course, is raised in that scenario. If you're going to fake a Bigfoot trackway, why would you fake an injured foot? Why wouldn't you just do two normal feet? I mean, I'm sure it's got to be hard to walk around on fake Bigfoot feet anyway. And I can only imagine how much more difficult it would be if you've got one foot that's malformed. There are other just little details that I just find absolutely compelling. One of them is this condition, I believe it's known as Morton's foot or Celtic toe. And those are just, again, colloquial terms for the second toe being longer than the big toe. And it occurs in roughly 10% of the population. These are the stats that I recall. So if they're wrong, people forgive me. But roughly 10% of the population has this, and roughly 10% of Bigfoot tracks also exhibit this as well. So that right there, it would almost represent a conspiracy of hoaxers to be so consistent across time and space. The other thing is some of the behavior that's exhibited is quite consistent with primates. People have noted piloerection, the hair standing on end in some of these Bigfoot encounters. A lot of indigenous art depicts their own Bigfoot analogs as having their lips pursed and a hooting formation, which is something that you would expect as well from a primate. And then you add to that the fact that there are all these hair samples and flesh samples that always come back inconclusive, right? Because we can't say it is a Bigfoot until we have a verified Bigfoot specimen to compare it to, right? That's the way DNA analysis works.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
But oftentimes they're highly consistent with primate DNA, and closest matches being human being or chimpanzee, that sort of thing. And these are samples that are taken from the Pacific Northwest and Canada and places like that. So again, it all adds up to a very compelling picture, especially when placed alongside eyewitness reports, that there is something genuinely anomalous going on here that does indeed resemble a relict species of hominid.
And then what are the arguments? I mean, you touched on many of them, but what are the arguments against this?
Well, the biggest one is the fact that we don't have a specimen. And the rebuttals to that you'll find from cryptozoology are the aforementioned aspect that we don't often run across bear and cougar carcasses. Even seasoned outdoorsmen will tell you this. But again, we have stumbled upon this from time to time. Another reason that's alleged that we don't have bodies is because Bigfoot bury their dead. Okay, that's highly speculative, but I'm willing to entertain that because I am convinced that if there is a flesh and blood creature out there, it's probably more like a human being than it is like an ape. Another thing that you'll hear is that porcupines will take off bones. So the body decomposes. We're unlucky enough to not stumble upon the body, but then the bones will get taken by porcupines and other forest animals that enjoy gnawing on bones. This is documented, so that makes sense. And then, of course, the ever-present clarion call of conspiracy that you hear throughout all these different modalities of the paranormal, that the government knows exactly that there is a group of undiscovered primates in the United States, at least, but that they are actively covering it up. And there is some degree of evidence to support that, although I tend
They're not helping their case. Look, with the Arrow report that came out, I think, earlier this week?
Yeah, just a couple of days ago, yeah.
It just feeds theories like that because that thing was ridiculous. It was insulted everyone's intelligence.
So if my hypothesis, if Bigfoot is flesh and blood, is correct, that they are more like human beings, then I can see how big of a scandal that would be that the United States government has neglected this group of human beings and not protected them for 250 or some odd years. That would be quite scandalous if there's this group of human beings living alongside us in the woods that are quite different, but at the same time still human, that the United States government has neglected. So yes, certainly that makes sense for a cover-up, right?
Well, I just want to know why they haven't paid taxes. That's where my scandal is.
I need a t-shirt that says tax Bigfoot. That would be great. Make Bigfoot pay.
That's not a bad idea, man.
Yeah, tax Bigfoot. Bigfoot tax. So those are the points and counterpoints that you'll hear from skeptics and from believers alike. The other thing that is pointed out quite often is that a lot of these ecosystems in which these sightings occur are not robust enough to sustain the caloric needs of an animal that is 8 feet tall. And, a lot of eyewitnesses will say 300 pounds, but if something is heavily muscled and 8 feet tall, it weighs significantly more than 300 pounds, I guarantee you. So the caloric needs of an animal like that would be absolutely immense. That's another rebuttal that you'll hear often. And then, of course, the constant stream of hoaxes, which are no stranger in the Bigfoot world, don't do much to really bolster the possibility of that. And then you'll get these people who will say things like, well, I've been camping and I've been outdoors all my life and I've never seen anything strange. My counterpoint to that is I've driven a car for several decades and I've never had a blowout. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So those are the most commonly cited pushbacks that you'll hear from the skeptics and how the believers like to sort of dance around those possibilities. But you do get sort of left with the sense that something isn't quite right. And Sean, I've noticed this thing in a lot of these different fields where if you can get the cryptozoologist or the ufologist or the ghost hunter to the bar after their lecture and you get a couple of drinks in them, they'll start to open up about some of their cherished beliefs regarding their subject matter. The ufologists will start to admit these profound synchronicities that seem to suggest that the UFO is bending reality. The ghost hunters will start to say, I'm not entirely sure that these are dead people. They seem to be something else, perhaps an egregore or a recording of emotions embedded in the landscape. And you can get the cryptozoologists to say, there's something not quite right about this thing, about Bigfoot. They'll say, it totally looks like a primate. And I would completely agree with that. All of the physical evidence points to a large primate in the woods, but they'll start to share their own anecdotes. They'll start to talk about all these little outliers that no one really likes to talk about these trackways that end in the middle of an open field, about these eyes that seem self-illuminating, about another subject of intense interest to me, about the lights that are seen at some of these big habituation spots. They'll say, well, we went out to examine this particular area where we have a lot of Bigfoot reports, and we've even seen Bigfoot ourselves, and we didn't see Bigfoot this night, but we saw these strange lights bobbing through the woods. And it's like, well, as my co-author of my 2 books on Bigfoot, Timothy Renner, said, it is rare to see a UFO. It is rare to see a Bigfoot. How many orders of magnitude rarer is it to see both of them in your lifetime, or both of them in the same area, or literally sometimes both of them in the same sighting, and for these things to not have some sort of connection? And once you start going down that path, you start to see that a lot of different encounters have aspects. It's not a one-to-one comparison. There are differences, plenty of differences. But a lot of these encounters do have aspects that are mirrored in other paranormal encounters that people have. Things like the Oz effect that you'll hear in conjunction with UFOs. To the opposite degree, things like these strange buzzing sounds like you'll hear in UFO accounts. You'll get stories of evidence that seems to miraculously vanish. You'll get a lot of stories. I've collected this in terms of both Bigfoot stories and Yowie stories of a large hairy primate basically tearing apart a camp and one witness being awake and trying, like literally beating on the other people in camp to wake up, and they just don't wake up. And that's something that you'll hear, obviously, in the UFO literature in terms of people who are sleeping beside their spouses as they're being abducted. They just can't be awoken. So there's something strange going on here, I'm convinced at this point. And I will not deny the consistency of evidence and how it points to a large hairy primate. But at the same time, you have to at least acknowledge these outliers. I do have a problem with cryptozoology in the sense that they are all about an eyewitness's testimony about the Bigfoot crossing the road. But the moment somebody says, and then it turned into a ball of light, it's like, okay, we're going to toss that in the rubbish bin. I was on a show one time and I was talking about an account where a Bigfoot vanished before someone's eyes. And they were very clear that it didn't duck behind a tree or into a ditch or anything. And the host said, well, couldn't the Bigfoot have just ducked out of sight or behind a bush or into a ditch? And I said, it is possible, but you keep walking that logic back and you wind up at the person saw a bear. Because if you're going to start taking away from their report and you're going to start calling into question what they saw, that's where you wind up is, oh, it was a misidentification. You wind up there every single time. So I'm not saying that every one of these anomalous Bigfoot stories is true, the strange Bigfoot stories, but at the same time, they have to be acknowledged. And you have to come up with an alternate idea alongside the flesh and blood hypothesis that integrates some of these outliers. Even if it proves to be a bunch of bunk, at least you've done the work and taken a look at that aspect as well.
So what are some of those theories? Let's assume it's not only just a hominid, or maybe it's not a hominid at all. What are some of those alternative theories based on the best available evidence?
Well, here we do cross into the highly speculative, and a lot of the hypotheses that you'll hear presented are consistent with what you would hear in the UFO domain. Obviously, given the fact that you have periods of time, like Stan Gordon talked about in his book, Silent Invasion, where Bigfoot is literally seen alongside UFOs in the summer of 73, I believe it was, in Pennsylvania. people start to say, well, maybe Bigfoot is an extraterrestrial, or Bigfoot is ET's pet, or Bigfoot is a piloted drone by extraterrestrials.
By the way, what event was that in 1973 in Pennsylvania?
It was an entire summer of sightings that took place where either a UFO would be seen and then a couple of hours later a Bigfoot would be seen, like in the exact same place. Some sightings together. It's all in Stan Gordon's book, Silent Invasion. The most famous example happened on a farm, and I believe it was Fayette County, and it was a giant barn-sized red orb of light that descended over a farm. And at the same time, when the family went to go investigate, they were approached along the fence line by at least two large hairy hominids with glowing eyes that were walking towards them. The family shot tracer rounds in the direction of these Bigfoot, and when a hit was struck, they said it sounded like someone dropping a stone into the water, and the creatures winked out of sight. Later, Stan Gordon showed up to that particular site. There were reports that law enforcement said that it was the UFO landing site remained bright enough to read a newspaper by. But the owner of the farm accompanied Stan back out to the location of the landing and basically had a vision, a convulsive fit, where he saw these apocalyptic visions and received this message that he was, if you read between the lines, he's the one to save the world, right? And in the aftermath of that particular encounter, the farmer experienced premonitions ranging from the substantial to the mundane, everything from plane crashes to what branch that bird is going to land on. I believe, if memory serves, he saw some spirits in his house and even had a visit paid to him by some allegedly U.S. Navy officials who sound an awful lot like Men in Black, who showed him pictures of UFOs and pictures of Bigfoot and promised that they'd return and, of course, never showed back up. So, and again, it's important to say that there might be UFOs over here and Bigfoot over here and spirits over here, and a category into which all those three are mingled. I guess what I'm arguing for is a plurality of explanations, right? So
right.
A classic example that I like to use, one that I'm quite sympathetic to. So we've just talked about the extraterrestrial example so far, right? We got a couple of more to go through. But in line with that sort of UFO connection, if you're familiar with Mike Cleland at all?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've interviewed him.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Afterward, I'll tell you about the owl that landed in my backyard. Okay. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Mike is one of my favorite people. And Mike will tell you that he believes in flesh and blood owls, right? That they poop and they breathe and they fly and they can be shot. But at the same time, all of his work illustrates, I think, without a doubt, that there is some sort of connection between the UFO phenomenon and owls. So obviously right there we have these two types of owls, if you will, existing alongside one another. But they're real owls, and there's something behind the UFO phenomenon that loves to appropriate the mask of the owl. So I'm open to the possibility that there is a small population of large relict hominids somewhere out there, and that's just another mask that the UFO phenomenon, or the capital P phenomenon that people are talking about nowadays writ large, likes to use to sort of interact with human beings. I think that's entirely possible. So that's kind of the UFO question. The other thing that comes up a lot is interdimensionality. Proponents of this theory point to reports of Bigfoot stepping through portals. They point to places around the world that are paranormal hotspots that have their own share of Bigfoot reports. There are also allusions to Bigfoot doing things like cloaking, or, as we talked about earlier, turning invisible. The cloaking and invisibility stories are really too common to ignore. They're certainly not a majority, and they're probably not a plurality, but there are enough to acknowledge. And supernatural/paranormal Bigfoot stories in general are more common than we want to acknowledge. I was at an event with Ken Gerhard back in August of 2022, and Ken is another person that I think highly of. I think highly of his work. He's a really nice guy, but he made mention that in one survey, only 30 out of 1,000 Bigfoot reports included high strangeness elements. And my rebuttal to Ken was, okay, well, number one, how many people are self-censoring? Number two, how many reports got thrown out for being too crazy? And number three, that's 3%, I guess. So how many paranormal grizzly bear stories do you have? I guarantee you it's fewer than 30 out of 1,000. So I think that these things need to be acknowledged. So we've got extraterrestrial hypothesis, we've got interdimensional hypothesis, and then we start getting more and more esoteric. The reason that they present consistent with primate behavior and anatomy is because they're the ghosts of primates, which is an idea that I'm certainly sympathetic to in my strange way. Then you have some people suggesting that there's something more along the lines of being elementals, similar to what we would interpret as the fairy folk, guardians of the forest, that sort of thing. Indeed, a lot of indigenous testimony does suggest this. And if you look to Western Europe, Ireland and the British Isles, those sorts of places, there were traditions of the Wadwoes or Woodwoes, which was a large hairy wild man that was closely associated with the fairy folk. You can draw parallels between the Wadwoes and the Green Man and Dionysus and Odin. All these figures are interrelated. And there are even allusions to the fairies dancing the dance of the Green Man, which was also called the Dance of the Monkeys, the fairies dancing the dance of the monkeys. So there's an interplay there with fairies and Bigfoot. And then you get into the domain of something like psychoids and Jungian archetypes and these sort of things. And I do find this persuasive. I haven't necessarily touched base with Timothy Renner on his feelings on this, but I believe he would be sympathetic with this as well, that the wild man is just another one of these powerful archetypes, and that is attested in the fact that we see it, again, worldwide distribution, and that perhaps sometimes these archetypes can become strong enough either through cultural belief or the individual belief to manifest. However, the rarest form that they manifest in the case of the wild man archetype, is the full-bodied apparition, flesh and blood appearing Bigfoot. And the less common manifestations of that archetype are the footprints, are the wood knocks, are the vocalizations, are the strange smells that people report in the forests. I myself have pioneered an idea that if you take the sort of Class B reports that you'll find on the BFRO website, the reports that have Bigfoot type activity but don't actually have a Bigfoot scene, if you were to take that subset of activity, again, wood knocks, thrown stones, strange smells, strange vocalizations, strange handprints and footprints, objects appearing or being taken from a campsite, if you were to take all those things and put them into a house, you'd say, oh, it's a poltergeist. So I sort of wonder if there's not something happening in the woods that is more akin to a forest poltergeist, or the term that I used was wildernessgeist. So it just goes to show you how mixed up all these things can become once you start broadening your perspective and incorporating these things. And to be frank, the ufologists have done a great job of holding on to their core beliefs of things like the ETH, while still acknowledging the cross interdisciplinary similarities to other phenomena. Cryptozoologists, not so much. They're pretty much staying in that materialist lane with this very 19th century colonial mindset of bag it and tag it and listen to the indigenous testimony, but not too much, because when they say it, it disappears, then we'll throw that out. You know what I mean? And I just find that uncomfortable on a lot of different levels. But once you do start to broaden your perspective, the consistencies become apparent in at least a strong subset of reports.
You alluded to this. I don't know if you outright said it, but a lot of these things could be yes ends, right?
Yeah.
So one possible theory is like the Missing 411 series. People sometimes disappear in areas where there's a lot of quartz, right? Quartz is typically the material you use in semiconductors, right? For the EN junction transistors, stuff like that. One alternative theory could be it's kind of like a terrestrial memory hologram, right? Where the land kind of soaks up and records what's happened there and just kind of plays it back, which could also be some form of paranormal activity. You could explain ghosts in those areas in particular.
Stone tape theory, that sort of thing, yeah.
Is that what it's called? Stone tape theory?
So there's an idea that was popularized that, like, literally, like the etchings or the grooves on the record, there was a psychic imprint left on the geology of the area. Yeah.
That could be one. And then the other one I think is more akin to your interdimensional hypothesis, which is everything vibrates at a certain frequency. And then sometimes the amplitude of those frequencies reach a peak at the same time, where the waves are briefly in phase. And then as a result, these things kind of step into our reality. They could also explain time in some way. So some ghosts might not necessarily be ghosts. They might be actual people from a different station on that.
And some aliens might be us seen in the past.
Sure.
Sort of thing.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm not endorsing any of these hypotheses, but
I think what you're driving at, though, is the fact that when I say something like archetypes, I might be describing another one of these more pragmatic versions of that term. It's just we're wrestling with language. I don't think that we have a really good way to describe a lot of this stuff. I find the missing 411 thing interesting because I've often said that it's a paranormal Rorschach test. Like, whatever you're really into is what you're going to see on it, because it looks like Bigfoot until it doesn't, and then it looks like fairy folk until it doesn't, and it looks like UFOs until it doesn't too. So, but yeah, I think language is a huge impediment to discussing any of this stuff. And that's why I've often thought that, as opposed to like putting a nail in exactly what I speculate it is, I find more utility in just saying, look at these consistencies across these different things. It seems to be the thing. And as far as the ontology of the thing, or what we should call the thing, who the heck knows? But it does seem to be the thing. And the vibration thing I've had a contentious relationship with, because I hear people talking about vibrations. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And again, it's the language problem partially. But, for the longest time, again, I have a love-hate relationship with the New Age as well.
Well, yeah, and I'm not coming at it from a New Age perspective. So by training, I'm an electrical engineer, right? And I focused on digital signal processing. So I'm familiar with Fourier transforms. Like, every function of time can be converted into a function of frequency, right? Like, that literally, that's what a Fourier transform is. And all I'm saying is, even if you go down to the atomic level, every atom vibrates at a certain frequency. And then as you extend or increase in complexity, everything's vibrating. Like, it's literally vibrating. Like, most of our atoms, I mean, you've heard this probably a million times, but we're 99.9% empty space,
yeah.
Right? So there's a lot of space where you could have things vibrating at different frequencies that
overlaid. And so at this point, at this point, are we talking about interdimensionality? So that's part of the language.
Right. Yeah. Right. I mean, even think about like a ceiling fan, right? If it vibrates fast enough, you can't see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true.
Right.
That's very true.
So, and again, think of a radio station too. Like, if you're not tuned to that station, you can't hear it, even though something is playing at a higher and lower frequency, respectively. Anyway, I'm not endorsing this theory, but I'm trying to get like this whole vibes thing and stuff like that. 10 years ago, I would have been like, this person is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. But
right. I was of a similar disposition in myself, but it wasn't until I looked into the research, and I can't recall the researcher off the top of my head, so forgive me, but I was looking into the question of sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis oftentimes trotted out as an explanation for alien abductions, even though we don't quite understand what sleep paralysis is, but that's fine. So what you'll hear is that the entities that are negative are low vibrational entities, and the entities that are positive are high vibrational entities. And I'm like, okay, yeah, more New Age dreck. But then I stumbled across some research that suggested that both out-of-body experiences and sleep paralysis could be induced in sleepers by administering electricity to the brain. And higher amperage manifested OBEs, and lower amperage manifested sleep paralysis. I'm like, so low vibration, negative entities, sleep paralysis.
So say more about this experiment.
There was a study by a gentleman named Michael N. Marsh, was the gentleman who conducted this study. His book was published by Oxford University Press in 2010 called Out of Body and Near-Death Experiences. And Marsh suggested that low amplitude electrical stimuli applied to the vestibular cortex of the brain evoke sensations of sinking or falling, while with higher currents, autoscopy, in other words, seeing yourself, and OBEs were elicited. So that's all I have at hand on that particular study. But I did think it was interesting that those two states, which we all sort of intuitively feel are related, right, seem to have some sort of relation within the context of a laboratory experiment. And it kind of makes me wonder if the process of astral traveling, which I have difficulty distinguishing from alien abductions at this point, isn't an act of having that raised and passing the threshold into the out-of-body experience, and then something happens during the return and everything stalls, and you wind up with sleep paralysis, which I've compared to having your car break down in a bad neighborhood. It's like you've stalled and everything's just, all those low vibrational entities are sort of stalking the periphery.
Yeah, it's almost like shocking you out of your body, right? It might have that. Anyway, we're speculating all over the map. The issue I have personally is like I haven't done engineering for 25 years.
Without consulting that book specifically, I don't know if those results have been replicated or the methodology or anything like that off the top of my head. But I guess here's what I'm getting at. And this is what I have found to be true across all these domains of interest of mine, is that these are really interesting conversations that we're finding our way to. And they're conversations that we wouldn't be having if we were talking about Bigfoot's diet or the length of Bigfoot trackways and stuff like that. It's just, I have to admit that I find some of that kind of dull. So there is some self-selection in terms of how often I platform these ideas. But I think that these are the bigger questions that are sort of asking us to interrogate what reality is.
Speaking of interrogating what reality is, have you had any experiences of Bigfoot, Sasquatch adjacent?
They might be Class B reports. Honestly, they're probably like Class C reports, although I think Class C reports are told secondhand, if I remember their particular rubric. But yeah, I've had 2 Bigfoot adjacent experiences. Again, no Bigfoot was seen, but it kind of makes you go, huh? The first of which was the most recent one, and it's by far the least interesting one, so I'll start with it. I had the good fortune of being invited along with Tim Renner to a conference in Rhode Island in 2019. And even though Tim and I were working on a book together at the time, which turned into Where the Footprints In Volume 1 and Volume 2, I hadn't really spent that much time with Tim. In fact, I hadn't met him at all at that point. So I got to stay with him and his family. It was wonderful, but we also got to go out to one of his research sites known as Site 7. And Site 7 is a place, a very unassuming location, honestly. You would never guess that this is a hot spot for these sort of things. It first came to Tim's attention because there were these lights in the forest that people who were Bigfoot enthusiasts were attributing to eyeshine. Of course, these lights glowed even when there wasn't any light being shown into the forest, but that's another conversation. So there are anomalous lights there, either in the form of eyeshine or in the form of orbs, and there have been some close-up sightings with some of the people that Tim works with of these orbs. But also large, tall, dark shadows that move, lots of strange vocalizations that are not completely consistent with the Sierra sounds that Ron Moorhead recorded, but they sort of invoke that sort of feeling. So I went out to Site 7 2 nights, I believe, in a row with Tim. And as is my luck, nothing really happened, with one exception, which was the moment we pulled up to the entrance of the research site. We got out of the car, and I'm standing there. I don't even think Tim had unloaded the car yet. And we hear a very clear huff and something heavy shuffling away through the leaves away from us. Like, this is within, I would say, within 30 seconds, if memory serves. Again, I didn't see Bigfoot. I'm familiar enough with the whitetail vocalizations that it wasn't a deer. I can say that for certain. I'm poor at identifying the difference between 4-foot footfalls and bipedal footfalls. I'm just bad at that. But Tim said he was pretty sure it sounded like 2 feet. And I will agree, it did sound like a big angry person huffing at us and shuffling through the leaves. So that's my first Bigfoot adjacent experience. The other one was back in 2013. My wife and I had gone on our honeymoon to the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Georgia. And in case anyone's unfamiliar, the mountains in northern Georgia are a Bigfoot hotspot. There are plenty of sightings that happen up there. Again, I wasn't writing books at the time, but I was always interested in Bigfoot. So we had a cabin that was at the top of an extremely steep driveway. I mean, I want to say 45 degrees. It probably wasn't 45 degrees, but it was the better part of a mile, super steep, at this cabin on the side of a mountain. So not something you would necessarily hike on a whim, right? So the last night that we're there, we're in the hot tub on the back deck, and it's overlooking this valley, and I'm being a drunken idiot, and I decide to make long Bigfoot whoops and howls out over the valley, just for the heck of it. The next day, we've all packed up, and we're getting ready to take stuff out of the car. My wife takes some small items out to the car, and she comes back in and says, "Why'd you do that?" I said, "What are you talking about?" She says, "The rock." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" We've been married for like 3 days, and now we're going to have our first argument over a strange rock. And she brings me out to the car, and behind the driver's side rear wheel, there's a rock about the size of a basketball that is like wedged behind the wheel. And I take a look at this rock, and the only place it could have rolled from is about 30 or 40 feet away, the side of the mountain. All the rocks on it are covered in red Georgia clay, so it doesn't look like it came from there, because this rock is, I guess no rocks are really clean, but this rock doesn't have any red mud on it. So that left me with the idea, well, if it didn't roll from over there, someone brought it up here, and they hauled this rock up this driveway. And then, if you're going to pull a prank, wouldn't you put it on top of my car or on my hood or something? Why would you just wedge it behind my wheel? And that, in conjunction with me being an idiot the night before and trying to call in Bigfoot, again, makes me wonder if it wasn't something genuinely strange. Of course, granted, again, not being as involved as I am in these topics then as I am today, I did not have the foresight to take a picture. There might be a picture on my wife's phone somewhere if I really looked back through her 10,000 photos that she has. But, I didn't take a photo of it at the time, and certainly didn't put anything in comparison for scale with it. But yeah, it was odd. So those are my two Bigfoot adjacent experiences that I've had.
All right. In terms of some of your Bigfoot books, what are they and where can folks find them?
I talk about Bigfoot in all of my books. I had to think about that for a moment. I talk about Bigfoot in all of my books, but the two that are solely dedicated to Bigfoot are Where the Footprints End, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Co-written with my friend Timothy Renner, and it runs the gamut of not only the strangeness that people report, but also some of the ways that the Bigfoot phenomenon seems to reflect other bits of folklore. A good example, before telling people where they can pick it up, that I'll provide is you will find certain groups of researchers in North America, especially in the western half of the U.S., will make the claim that Bigfoot likes to sneak into stables at night and braid horses' manes. And it sounds kind of silly. I have run across similar accounts supposedly witnessed by Russian cryptozoologists, but I think that most of these are people who don't brush out their horses' manes when they put them up for the night. But that's neither here nor there. The part that I find interesting is that the exact same observation, if you were to transpose it to Dorset in 1750 something, would have been attributed to witches or would have been attributed to fairies. It was said that the fairies would sneak into stables at night and braid the horse's hair. Similar to this day, there are some pockets of the population in places like Nova Scotia that still believe that fairies do sneak into barns and stables overnight and braid horses' hair. So I think it's interesting that whatever our monster du jour is, we seem to graph our observations onto, regardless of whether or not there's an actual connection there. But then we also talk about things like those abruptly stopping trackways, these footprints that have 3 toes, which really has no precedent in primate anatomy. Some of the sort of things that traditional cryptozoologists aren't really fond of talking about. Classic example of that is the Ape Canyon attack from Mount St. Helens in the 1930s, I believe it was. One of these hallmark cases of cryptozoology that gets retold time and time again in Bigfoot books, but doesn't mention the fact that the miners were led there by a white arrow in the sky. The primary witness from which we know about the Ape Canyon event had a spiritual guide. There was a pair of footprints that were in the middle of the sandbar that looked, in their words, as if it had been dropped from the sky and picked back up. There were apports at the cabin at the Vander White mine where the Ape Canyon attack happened. So a lot of high strangeness that just sort of gets swept under the rug. So that's what those 2 books are about. And they can be bought on Amazon or bought directly through Timothy Renner. But I think since I'm here, I'll focus on how they can get them through me. I have copies that are signed by both myself and Tim for sale. And you can reach out to me at joshuacutchin.com. That's JOSHUACUTCHIN.com.
All right. Well, thank you, Josh. It was an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.
Likewise. Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's two options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much and keep watching. I really appreciate it.